fishing man out on the lake. All you need is a line and a pole that'll never break.
Bonjour, boiseau BCBG. Le boiseau BCBG, c'est moi, le Redneck Preppy. Comment allez-vous aujourd'hui? Super? Bien. Recently, I made a video where I discussed the difference between cover and structure in fishing. I made a deliberate choice in that video to avoid the topic of edges, since I didn't really want to overburden. Well, today I come in to fill in that picture a little further by adding another variable to the mix. So, what is an edge? It sounds obvious, but there's a bit more to it than most people would think at first. At its simplest, an edge is essentially a boundary between different things. Yes, I admit that was rather vague. Okay, to give a few examples that I think will illustrate what I'm talking about, an edge is the surface, the bottom, where two different kinds of plants meet. A shade line, a place where vegetation ends and opens into water, and vice versa, the shoreline, among many other examples. Edges are everywhere when it comes to fishing, and edges can be where the fish are waiting for your bait or lure. So why are edges so important? Well, as you probably realized from the examples I just gave you, edges basically influence fish behavior and movement. Let's look at the example of the surface. Now, from your perspective, the surface is a pretty simple thing. It's where the water begins. From the fish's perspective, the surface is where the water ends. It's essentially the ceiling of its world. It can't go any higher than the surface. As it's essentially a barrier to all fish, predator fish often use the surface as a wall to trap smaller fish against. That's of course what you're seeing when fish are feeding at the surface. And whether you realized it or not, when you're fishing a topwater lure, you're using the edge to mimic the behavior of prey fish. Many topwater lures, such as poppers, are imitating the behavior of prey fish breaching the surface in an attempt to escape predators. Another excellent example of an edge that most people use without formally thinking about it that way is a shade line. Shade can play an enormous role in fishing. At its simplest, an area of shade is obviously a place of cooler water. That's important in the middle of summer, so fishing that shade line in shallow waters at that time of the year can be very productive. You can often catch a nice fish as a lure either comes out of the shade into brighter water or off particularly dark spots of shade into slightly lighter ones. And remember, those shade lines change throughout the day as the sun makes its journey across the sky. So shade lines are constantly moving or being newly created wherever you're fishing. A line of vegetation is an obvious edge, and once again, you'll find fish using it to stage ambushes out of it. Shoreline is also similar to the surface in that it represents a hard edge, one that predators can use to herd their prey towards, or prey can take refuge in if the water is sufficiently shallow that larger fish can't enter. Now at this point you'll probably be a little confused because what I've been describing sounds a little like cover and a little like structure mixed together. After all, both of those also influence fish behavior and movement, and things like the lake bottom is structure while stuff like vegetation is cover. Well, in the video where I discussed structure and cover, I described the former as the street and cover being the houses on that street that the fish lived in. Now, to build out a clunky metaphor a little further, you can look at edges as being those defined areas that separate the good houses or neighborhoods from the bad. The fish would rather stay in the safe neighborhoods on the nice streets, but occasionally will dart into other less desirable areas if there's a particularly good pizza place there. Now, I said earlier that you're surrounded by edges when you're fishing, and while that's true, I think when it comes to pondering edges, you can confine your efforts to 4 main areas: the surface, the bottom, vegetation lines, and shade lines. So for lures that you'd use on the surface, you're looking at things like topwaters, buzz baits, spinner baits, among many other lures that mimic something on the top of the water and in distress. On the bottom, that can mean things like jigs and tubes and Texas-rigged soft plastics, among many, many others. Edges, which are vegetation lines, can be fished with almost anything, including surface and subsurface lures, hard and soft lures, anything that can entice a fish out of the vegetation. There are way too many to name. And finally, ditto for shade lines, fishing jerk baits, swim baits, topwaters, and vertical presentations. They hang a lure just outside or along the shade line. I could sit for an hour rhyming off all the lures that you could use in that situation. If you're still confused, look at it this way. In that cover and structure video that I mentioned earlier, I used the example of a hump that had some vegetation growing on one side of it. Now imagine that vegetation was bisected by a shade line. Suddenly, you have a spot on the spot that you can target. You have an edge on cover that's situated on structure. Long story short, edges are another way of attempting to predict a fish's behavior and movement. When used in concert with cover and structure, you can put together a sophisticated picture of the area that you're fishing. At a minimum, edges will help you potentially eliminate the areas that are less likely to hold fish. At any rate, I hope you found today's video to be at least vaguely entertaining and mildly informative. As always, I hope your lines are always tight and stay away from my secret spots, which I'm not going to tell you where they are because they're secret. Take care and bye-bye.